on the New Age movement with, with crystals and, talking about all the different New Age phenomena that became very popular in the 80s and is still with us to this day. And Shirley MacLaine was on the front cover holding the crystals. And in that piece, they talked about, in the introduction of that piece at the beginning of the magazine, they talked about how we don't know where the term New Age came from or where it's going. Well, the Bible tells us, Jesus said in the last days there would be this false, this religious movement, which would be saying the time draws near, which would be predicting a new age, and which would have its basis in satanic or false miracles, which is what the New Age movement's all about. So we know where it's going.
In 1904, a man named Aleister Crowley channeled a spirit who inspired a series of writings known as the Book of the Law. According to the introduction of the work, the book was dictated in Cairo, Egypt, between noon and 1 p.m. on 3 successive days. The author, a demonic spirit, called himself Aiwass and claimed to be a messenger from the forces ruling this earth at present. This description is quite revealing, since Jesus referred to Satan as the prince or ruler of this world. Satan is also called the god of this world by the Apostle Paul. In this Book of the Law, Crowley set down the chief principle for what he called the new eon. He wrote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt." This declaration is in contrast to the example of Christ in the Bible. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed, "Father, not as I will, but as thou wilt," in obedience to God. But in the Book of the Law, Crowley turns the tables and teaches men not as God wills, but rather, "Do what thou wilt." This promotion of self-will that so often leads to self-empowerment is perhaps the climax of man's desire to be his own God, to rule over himself rather than live in obedience to the God who created him. Jesus said, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it." Having thoroughly rejected the gospel of Jesus Christ, Aleister Crowley would earn the title of the wickedest man in the world by the London newspapers. The British media exposed his bizarre satanic rituals at the mysterious Abbey Thelema in Sicily. On one occasion, a man named Raoul Loveday died from drinking poisoned cat's blood at Crowley's command. Loveday's widow returned to London and exposed Crowley's wicked behavior to the world. When he was a child, Crowley's own mother referred to him as the Beast. According to Crowley researcher James W. Revac, he quickly identified with the title, and for the rest of his life, he viewed himself as the Beast of the Apocalypse, the enemy of Christianity. Like all New Age adherents, past and present, Crowley revered the serpent's lie from the Garden of Eden. He wrote, "This serpent, Satan, is not the enemy of man, but he who made gods of our race, knowing good and evil. He bade know thyself and taught initiation." Through the 20th century, the influence of this black magician and professing Satanist upon popular culture has compelled some researchers to consider him the real father of the modern New Age movement.
Well, he's basically not only the father of modern Satanism and the most highly regarded Satanist of the last century, he is also the father of the modern New Age movement, which is extensive around the Western world today. I won't say he single-handedly ushered in the New Age movement, but he, more so than any other human being, was instrumental in the popularization of the New Age movement. Altered states of consciousness, trying to make altered states of consciousness scientific, through whether it be hallucinogens and seeing reality different, and using the comparisons of a microscope and a looking into a different reality on a spiritual level, whether it was drugs, whether it was astrology or the practice of ritual magic, whether it was sex magic, whether it was his ideas of world unity through magic and so forth. All these are very popular through the 1960s and after that in ushering in what today is called the New Age movement. But he was very, very powerful as far as, I mean, more so than anybody. Satanists will admit that Aleister Crowley was, the Satanist of the 20th century. Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, which was more notorious than Aleister Crowley's group, was simply pop Satanism to many serious Satanists.
Hail Satan!
Hail Satan!
Shem Ham Farash!
Shem Ham Farash!
Hail Satan!
Hail Satan!
And even Anton LaVey's group, I mean, Anton LaVey's library was chock full of Aleister Crowley's books. The co-founder of the Church of Satan with Anton LaVey, Kenneth Anger, was an avowed Satanist who was a follower of Aleister Crowley. And many of his works, Invocation to My Demon Brother, Lucifer Rising, and so forth, videos that he made in the late 60s extolling Satanism, were all about Aleister Crowley, unveiling a picture of Crowley and that's worshipped and so forth. In regard to Satanism, his name comes up over and over again in satanic music and so forth. But even more importantly, in regard to the New Age movement, in the early 1900s, Aleister Crowley was talking about the new eon. Ionis is a Greek word for age, and the new eon being the new age. And what's interesting about Crowley's emphasis on the new age, it had everything to do with what became popular in the 1960s.
In his shocking 10-hour documentary, They Sold Their Souls for Rock and Roll, Pastor Joe Schimmel exposes the role of music in furthering the New Age through the 1960s counterculture movement and reveals Aleister Crowley as the patron saint of rock musicians.
I can't think of any other occultist who's been more influential on rock musicians than Aleister Crowley, no one close. London Times called Crowley the unsung hero of the 1960s. In fact, if you look at the 1960s counterculture leaders, John Lennon, he said his whole philosophy was, and he quoting Aleister Crowley's axiom, "Do what thou wilt," was the whole Beatles philosophy, he said in his interviews before his death was, "Do what thou wilt." And they put their heroes up on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, and who did they place there? Aleister Crowley. In fact, that whole album, as we show in our rockumentary, was basically a tribute to Crowley's New Eon, along with their Satanic Majesty's Request by the Stones that the Beatles put out with Sgt. Pepper. In fact, we make a really clear case for Sgt. Pepper being Crowley. In fact, Crowley died 20 years before that album came out. And, of course, the song 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play.
It was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play.
It's quite interesting because not only was Lennon and the Beatles into Aleister Crowley, but we show the Rolling Stones and how they were into Crowley, and Mick Jagger and Keith Richards helping out with even Kenneth Anger's movies, pushing Aleister Crowley's Satanism in Lucifer Rising and so forth. So you have the Stones, you have the Beatles, the two biggest rock bands of the 1960s. You have Jim Morrison with a bust of Aleister Crowley, the biggest American rock idol of the 60s, on his album 13. We can go on and on. Led Zeppelin, the biggest band of the 1970s, Jimmy Page buying Aleister Crowley's mansion overlooking Loch Ness, being full on into Aleister Crowley, using implements of his temple on the Presence album on the front cover, as Crowley talked about in his books on ritual magic, and even down to his symbol, Zoso, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, which is really soul, spelled forward, and soul spelled backwards, of the solar god. Soul was S-O-L, the god of, or Satan, in Crowley's books. It was another symbol of Satan, S-O-L, and that was Jimmy Page's occult symbol that he used that nobody could decipher. And recently in Rolling Stone magazine interview in 2002, they all came out and said what their symbol meant, except Page still wouldn't come out and say what his meant. But Crowley said to write backwards and forward. If you look at that symbol closely, it's soul, forward and backwards. So that's still not known to even the rock world what that symbol was, but Jimmy Page has admitted being an admirer of Crowley, practicing Crowley's magic for power and so forth, and they became very powerful. These bands sold their soul for rock and roll, so to speak.
This chilling song, performed by Crowley disciple Ozzy Osbourne, is said to reveal perhaps the darkest side of the New Age. In the latter half of the song, listen as Osbourne calls upon Crowley, known as the Great Beast, to ride his white horse. Schimmel and others believe this to be symbolic of the coming Antichrist, known as the first horseman of the apocalypse. In the book of Revelation we read, "And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer." In his writings, Aleister Crowley would refer to Antichrist as the crowned and conquering child, the Lord of the Eon. Standing with their backs to the wall is a key phrase in this song. Some researchers believe it denotes the mass murder of those who refuse to worship the New Age Christ. Standing with their backs to the wall, awaiting execution.
And ultimately, that's where all this is leading. I mean, it's all about peace and love on the outside. But when it all comes down, there's going to be a brutal leader that will emerge, who Crowley was forthright enough to talk about in his books, and talk about this bloodbath that would come, wherein Christians would be put to death in the establishment of the New World Order.
But is this merely the radical view of a drug-crazed Satanist like Aleister Crowley? Or is there, as many suggest, a global effort at work? We remind the viewer that the 20th century is without question the bloodiest in man's history. Some 170 million lives were lost to Nazism, communism, and the various killing fields of the world because of the darkness in the hearts of men. The Bible warns that the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, including murder. Next, we turn to the town of Elberton, Georgia, the granite capital of the world. Elberton is famous for its production of tombstones, exporting some 250,000 tombstones every year. Oddly enough, the town that makes a living through death is also the home of what some consider the most threatening monument in America. Ruling this earth at present. This description is quite revealing, since Jesus referred to Satan as the prince or ruler of this world. Satan is also called the god of this world by the Apostle Paul. In this
on the New Age movement with crystals and talking about all the different New Age phenomena that became very popular in the 80s and is still with us to this day. And Shirley MacLaine was on the front cover holding the crystals, and in that piece they talked about which would have its basis in satanic or false miracles, which is what the New Age movement's all about. So we know where it's going.
In 1904, a man named Aleister Crowley channeled a spirit who inspired a series of writings known as the Book of the Law. According to the introduction of the work, the book was dictated in Cairo, Egypt, between noon and 1 p.m. on 3 successive days. The author, a demonic spirit, called himself Aiwas and claimed to be a messenger from the fourth.
In the introduction to that piece at the beginning of the magazine, they talked about how we don't know where the term New Age came from or where it's going. Well, the Bible tells us, Jesus said in the last days there would be this false, this religious movement, which would be saying the time draws near, which would be predicting a new age, and would